Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and we're really getting to the end of our biology course. For this unit, what we're going to do is I have some state test review questions. So what I'd like for y'all to do each day is there's about 10 or 15 questions. They're all centered around the same standards. So what I'd like for y'all to do, teacher, go ahead. If you could pass this out to your students, y'all take 15, 20 minutes, work on it by yourself or with a partner, and when you're ready for the review, when you want the answers, come back to me, unpause the video, and I'll do them on the board behind me. So go ahead and get started, and then we'll take a look at them here in just a moment. All right, I'm sure that didn't give y'all any problem, but just in case it did, we're going to take a look at them. So let's go ahead and get started and see what the first one is here. All right, so here's what we're doing. 13, this one says, write the characteristics in the boxes in the chart to compare living and non-living things. So we have a list of 6 things down here, and it's our job to decide which one of them are characteristics of living things and which ones are characteristics of non-living things. So let's go ahead and get started. The first one here says cannot grow. That's definitely going to be a non-living characteristic. So cannot grow should go over here on the right. Okay, let's go to the next one, can reproduce. Which of these two can reproduce? That is the living characteristics, can reproduce. Okay, we've talked about all of these things throughout the year, so these are just that information kind of in question form, and we're seeing if we can remember what we talked about. The next one here says can respond to stimuli. That's going to be living as well, so can respond. All right, the next one here says can release energy for work. Okay, well that's also going to be a living characteristic. All right, and we got one more here. It says exists without taking in energy. That is a non-living characteristic. All right, great. So let's go on to our next one. All right, here's the next question. It says, the discovery of cells was made possible by the invention and refinement of the microscope. Over the years, different individuals produced evidence for what is now known as the cell theory. 4 scientists are primarily credited with establishing the 3 basic concepts of the cell theory. Mark one box in each row of the table below to identify the scientists most associated with the cell theory concept listed. All right, the first one says all living things are made up of cells. Plants and animals are made up of cells. This should be Schleiden and Schwann. We talked about earlier this year how Schwann was the one that figured out all animals are made up of cells, and to me Schwann kind of sounds like the animal swan, so that's an easy way to remember that. Schleiden was a botanist, and so he figured out all plants are made up of cells. All right, let's go to the next one. Cells come from cells. Diseased cells produce diseased cells. This was this guy named Virchow, and that has a really big, that plays an important role when it comes to the germ theory on how people get sick. All right, here's the last one for this question. It says the cell theory is the basic unit of life. Cells can be studied scientifically. This is Hooke, and one thing I really want you to remember about him, Hooke took a look, and what did he see? He was the first person to see cells, and he was looking at cork specifically. Great job. Let's keep it going. Here's the next one. This says the classification of viruses as living or non-living entities has changed throughout history. Initially thought to be poisons, viruses have been classified over time as specialized form of life and as biological chemical. Today, their classification remains uncertain. Write the number next to each claim next to the one piece of evidence that best supports that claim. So we've got 2 claims down here. Viruses are living and viruses are non-living. And it's our job to decide which of these 2 supports that piece of evidence. So let's do this one first. Viruses are living. Which of these in this box best supports that claim? To me, it's going to be this one. Each virus has either RNA or DNA compounds that are found in cells. Remember that all living things have DNA or RNA in their cells. Viruses do as well, and so that's one piece of evidence that would make you think that they might be alive. Let's go to the next one. Viruses are non-living. Which one in the box best supports that claim? To me, it's going to be this one. viruses must use living cells to reproduce additional viruses. So this is why we do not consider them as living things. Viruses can't reproduce on their own. They need a host, and so that would make them non-living. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, this says the model shows the levels of biological organization from least complex to most complex in a human. Write each label in the correct box. So this is something called levels of organization. What we have to do is be able to sort these in order from smallest to biggest. So we've got these different answers down here, and it's our job to write them in the box on which one they go with. So starting way over here on the left, this is going to be a cell. That's the basic unit of structure and function for life. Okay, when cells come together and make a team, when cells are working together, they make something called a tissue. So this next one is a tissue. Okay, when different tissues come together to complete a job, they make something called an organ. So this picture right there in the middle, that's the heart. The heart is an organ. Okay, when organs come together and they're working together to get a job done, they'll make something called an organ system. The heart is part of the cardiovascular system. So that next one is going to be organ system. When many organ systems come together, they make an organism, and that is a living thing. So that should be our order for that one. Great, let's keep it going. This says, the diagram shows components of the human excretory system. Which statement best describes an example of organization within this system? So it's our job to decide which of these best is going to fit and make this statement true. Let's look at our answer choices here, okay? So to me, the best answer choice is probably going to be C. The bladder is an organ composed of muscle tissue that helps eliminate fluid waste. These other ones just aren't really that accurate. When you look at them, they're using those different levels of organization incorrectly. So this is the one that really describes it the best. The bladder is an organ, that's true, and remember that organs are made up of tissues, and here it's saying it's made up of muscle tissue, and that its job is to help eliminate the fluid waste. So all of that's true, so C is going to be our best answer choice there. Let's keep it going. Here's the next one. All right, number 9. This says, a student is studying living things. The student made the following list of characteristics to describe only living things. So all of these things are describing living things. Okay, it says another student claims that some characteristics on the list also describe non-living things. Which characteristics from the list should be removed so that the list describes only living things? So it's our job here to decide which ones we think are not describing only living things. To me, A is going to be really good. This says 1, so are made up of atoms. Everything's made up of atoms, whether you're living or not. And then the last one, 3, there says are capable of movement. Well, we know like things like clouds and fire, they're able to move even though they're not alive. So this is the correct answer. 1 and 3 are describing things that are not necessarily alive. Okay, great. So let's keep that going. Okay. This says, a student is studying a continued argument within the scientific community. Are viruses living or non-living? Record an X in each row to identify whether each evidence statement supports that claim that viruses are living or that the claim that viruses are non-living. Okay, so it's our job to put these X's in the right box here. So viruses can replicate. Does that make it more likely that the viruses are living or non-living? Well, living things can replicate, so to me that would make it seem like they're living. Okay, how about viruses change over time? Well, same thing, most living things change over time, so that would be evidence that supports that it might be a living thing. All right, how about this next one? Viruses do not grow or develop. Well, living things do grow and develop, so if viruses don't do that, then that's evidence that they are non-living. Okay, this next one, viruses contain genetic information. Well, living things contain genetic information in the form of DNA and RNA. If viruses do that, then that might be evidence that supports that they are alive. All right, this next one, viruses do not contain one or more cells. That would be evidence that supports that it is non-living. Remember, one thing about the cell theory states that all living things are made up of cells. Okay, and then the last one here, viruses do not obtain or use their own energy. Well, living things usually do that, and so that would be evidence that viruses are not considered living things. Okay, let's keep it going. Which 2 options identify contributors to the cell theory that are attributed to Robert Hooke? So Robert Hooke came up with which 2 of these things in this list? Well, he did discover and name cells. Remember that he looked at cork under the microscope, He thought they looked like little cells that monks stay in, like small rooms, and so that's where the name cell comes from. And then the next one, C, he absorbed a cork cell under a microscope. So those are the two things that he did. He named them, and he also discovered them. Remember, Hooke took a look, and he saw cells. Okay, great. So let's keep it going. All right, a student purchased a geranium plant from a greenhouse. The student used the materials below to transfer the geranium plant to a new container. Which criterion and reasoning work together to correctly classify a material from the list as living or non-living? Okay, so for this, our best answer choice is going to be D. Living things require nutrients and non-living things do not. The reasoning here is that since the geranium plant uses the fertilizer to grow, the geranium plant is living. Okay, great work. Let's keep this going. All right, so here's our next one. This says the diagram below shows a piece of DNA and the proteins made from this DNA. Which characteristics of the DNA helps it function as a set of instructions for making these specific proteins? Well, we should know that for this one, the answer is going to be C. It's the way in which the nucleotides are ordered on the DNA. You might remember that each of these little lines here are nitrogen bases, and depending on the order of these nitrogen bases, they code for different proteins. So those nitrogen bases are A, C, T, and G, and they can really be in any order, but the order that they're in determines which protein you're going to make. So C is going to be our correct answer there. Great, okay, so let's keep this going. I just got a couple more on for this one, okay? So this says, use the following scenario to answer the next two questions. Okay, so this is a graph. What's going on here is, what we really want to look at is this graph down here. It's showing the rate, the enzyme activity at different temperatures. So what's going on here is that on the y-axis, this is how much the reaction is happening. Okay, the rate of the reaction is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is the temperature. Okay. So the question that we'll see on the next slide is going to ask us, based on the graph, what temperature range should be considered the optimum temperature for this enzyme. So looking at this graph, is there a place on this graph where it looks like the enzyme is doing the most amount of work? Well, remember that the y-axis here is the rate of reaction and the x-axis is the temperature, okay? So what it's really asking us is, where is it the highest on this graph? Well, we can see that up here, right, this is where the reactions are taking place the fastest because it's really high on that y-axis. So what we should be able to see is that there's a range of temperature. It's about 28, there's a small range of temperature here where the enzyme is working really well, and that range is about 28 to 38. And I'll just back up to the next slide so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. You see right there the temperature 28 to 38, that's where that peak on the curve is on the graph, so that's going to be our best answer for this one, okay, between 28 and 38 degrees Celsius. Great, all right, let's keep it going to this one. Okay, so this says, researchers in a lab performed an experiment to evaluate the function of an enzyme mixture. The graph shows the results. So something kind of similar here. We have how well the enzyme is working on the y-axis and then the temperature on the x-axis here. For this one, it wants us to circle a word or phrase in each set of options to correctly describe the variables in this experiment. Okay, so for this one, the independent variable here is the temperature, okay, and the dependent variable is the relative activity. So what we can see here is that by changing the temperature, that is having a direct correlation to what is happening to the enzyme activity. So when the temperature is here at about 55 degrees, the enzyme is happening, the reactions are happening very quickly. If we continue to increase that temperature up to 75, the reaction of the enzyme responds to the temperature and it goes down a lot. So this is the correct answer for this one. The temperature is the independent variable and the reaction is the relative activity is the dependent variable. Okay, great. So this is the last one for this one. Then we'll move on. This says, in additional experimental trials, The researchers gathered more data about the function of the enzyme mixture. The graph below summarizes their results. Okay, so for here we want to circle a word or phrase in each set of options to best explain these data. So what we want to do for this one, at higher temperatures, the enzyme functions most efficiently when pH is lower, and at lower temperatures, the enzyme can tolerate higher pH values. So you can see here that when the temperature is high, it works very well when the pH is low, and when the temperature is low, the enzymes can tolerate higher pH values. So that's all of the questions for today. Thank you all so much for following along with me. Your teacher has some other work for you to do, so make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.